It started so small that I barely noticed at first. The occasional creak or groan from the house, which I brushed off as old pipes or floorboards settling. I mean, every house makes noises, right? That's what I told myself. I just moved into this place a few months ago, an old house at the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it had character. It had been quiet most nights until that one particular evening. I was chilling on the couch, half watching a movie, half scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A noise upstairs. It wasn't loud, but enough to make me pause. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking from one room to another. My first thought was maybe it was something outside, like the wind blowing against the house, or a raccoon on the roof. But it wasn't windy that night. I muted the TV and sat up, listening hard. Thump, thump, thump. There it was again, right above me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe I'd left the window open and the breeze was moving things around. But that didn't explain the heaviness of the sound, like someone walking in boots. I grabbed my phone, my heart started to race a little, and texted Jason, my best friend. He'd lived in a lot of old places and always had some logical explanation for weird stuff like this. Yo, I think there's someone in my house, I typed, trying to keep it cool. Jason replied almost instantly, like he was just waiting to mess with me. Ghosts, bro told you that house was creepy. Then he added a laughing emoji. Real helpful. But the thing is, I wasn't laughing. I stared up at the ceiling, half expecting the footsteps to come down the stairs. I even got up and checked the front door to make sure it was locked. I stood there in the hallway for a minute, just listening. The house was dead silent now. No footsteps, no creaking, nothing. I shook my head, feeling a little silly for freaking out. Must be the house settling, I muttered to myself, trying to sound casual. But deep down, something didn't sit right with me. I've lived in places where the walls creak, where pipes make noise when they heat up. This wasn't like that. These were footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone deliberately walking around upstairs. I finally decided to head to bed, but as I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there at the bottom of the stairs, watching me. Of course, there was no one, just my imagination playing tricks on me. I checked all the rooms upstairs, tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Everything was in its place. No open windows, no sign of anything strange. Still, when I got into bed, I locked my bedroom door, just in case. As I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but listen for the sounds again. The house was quiet now, almost too quiet, like it was waiting for something. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a cold sweat, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, my eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling hadn't gone away. I told myself it was just nerves from moving into a new place. Maybe the stress of getting settled was messing with my head. But then, just as I was about to drift back to sleep, I heard it again. This time it was closer. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't upstairs anymore. It was in the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. The footsteps stopped, but the tension didn't leave my chest. I lay there, frozen, staring at my bedroom door. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just the house creaking again, or maybe someone had actually broken in. Every little noise felt amplified in the dark. Each creak or shift in the house making my heart skip a beat. I couldn't just stay there and do nothing, though. I needed to check. My hand fumbled around for the baseball bat I kept by the side of the bed, my fingers trembling slightly as I gripped it tightly. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I slowly slid out from under the covers, every muscle tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I crept to the door, my breath shallow, and pressed my ear against it. For a few moments, everything was still. Too still. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. It was like whoever or whatever had been there was just standing outside, listening, waiting. I had to know. With my free hand, I turned the doorknob slowly, so slow it barely made a sound. The door creaked open just a few inches, enough for me to peek through the gap. At first, I didn't see anything, just a dimly lit hallway. But as I let my eyes adjust to the shadows, I saw it, him. There was a figure, a dark silhouette, standing at the far end of the hall. He wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, just standing there like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. My breath caught in my throat. He was tall, his outline sharp against the soft light coming through the window behind him, but there were no details. No face, no clothes, just a solid, dark shape like a shadow that didn't belong. I stood there, frozen, staring at the figure, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Was this some kind of trick? A hallucination? My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to shut the door, to hide under the covers, but I couldn't look away. I gripped the bat tighter, trying to muster up the courage to speak, but all I could manage was a shaky whisper. "Who are you?" Nothing. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if it hadn't heard me at all. "Hey," I asked who you are. I said, a little louder this time, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Still nothing. It was like shouting into a void. I took a step back, my heart hammering harder now, and I slammed the door shut. I stood there, holding the knob, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. People don't just stand like that, silent and still, in your house. I paced around my room, unsure what to do next. Should I call the cops? What would I even say? "Yeah, hi, there's a shadow man in my hallway." They'd laugh me off the phone or think I was losing it. Hell, I was starting to think I was losing it. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing there, just staring, if you could even call it that, with no face, no eyes, no features at all. I sat down on the edge of my bed, gripping the bat like it could actually protect me from whatever this was. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. I was too wired, too freaked out to even think about sleeping. I just sat there, listening, waiting for another noise, another sign that the figure was still out there. But nothing came. The house was silent again, like it always had been, like everything I just experienced was in my head. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door again. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it open and peeked down the hall. It was empty. No shadow, no figure, nothing. The only thing I saw was the faint glow of moonlight through the window, casting soft patterns on the floor. I stepped out into the hallway, bat still in hand, and cautiously walked down to where I'd seen the figure. I searched every corner, every shadow, but there was no sign of him. The house felt normal again. It looked exactly the same as it always did. Quiet, empty, harmless. But the unease hadn't left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone in the house. I checked every room, even open closets, looked under the bed. Anything to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. By the time I finished, I was more exhausted than scared. I climbed back into bed, locking the door behind me, and pulled the covers up tight. I kept the bat close, though, just in case. But even as I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that there was no one in the house but me, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever I had seen, it didn't feel like my imagination. It felt real. Too real. The next day, I tried to put it behind me. I told myself it was just some weird dream, that I was probably stressed or overtired, and my mind had decided to play tricks on me. But even though I tried to convince myself that everything was normal, the house felt different. The air was heavier, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even in broad daylight. I had planned to spend the day out, anything to get away from the creeping unease that clung to the house. A walk in the park, maybe grabbing lunch with Jason, just something to take my mind off things. I locked up and left, trying to ignore the nagging voice in the back of my head that told me something wasn't right. When I came back later that afternoon, the sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows across the yard. As I walked up to the front door, that strange feeling hit me again, the sense that something was watching. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house, trying to figure out what felt so off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but everything seemed off balance. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling a wave of relief as I entered the familiar space. It looked exactly the same as I'd left it, quiet and still like nothing had ever happened. Maybe it really had all been in my head. But then I noticed something strange. The door to my bedroom, the one I had locked before I left, was closed. Not just closed, though locked. From the inside, I stopped in my tracks, staring at the door. That didn't make any sense. I never locked it from the inside. Hell, I don't think I even could lock it from the inside unless I was already in the room. My heart started racing again. The same panic I'd felt the night before creeping back up my spine. I slowly walked toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I gave it a gentle turn, but the knob wouldn't budge. It was definitely locked. I stood there, trying to figure out how this was possible. Maybe I had somehow locked it without realizing, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, it didn't make sense. I knocked on the door, my knuckles tapping against the wood, feeling foolish as soon as I did. Who was I knocking for? There was no one in there. There couldn't be. Still, I called out, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" My voice echoed down the empty hallway. Silence. Of course, no answer. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone to text Jason again. I wasn't going to admit it, but I was starting to freak out a little. Before I could type anything, I paused. This wasn't something I could explain over text. What was I even going to say? Instead, I took a deep breath and did the only thing that seemed logical at the time. I went downstairs, grabbed the spare key from my bedroom, and headed back up. I stood there for a second, staring at the door, half expecting it to unlock itself as soon as I got close. But it didn't. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The click echoed loudly in the silence, and I braced myself, feeling my pulse in my throat. The door creaked open, slowly revealing the room beyond. I hesitated before stepping inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room looked exactly the same as I'd left it. The bed was made, my clothes were tossed on the chair in the corner, and the blinds were half drawn. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet something felt wrong. I checked the windows, making sure they were all closed and locked. They were. I looked under the bed, in the closet, anywhere someone might hide. But there was no sign that anyone had been there. No clues, no explanation for how the door had locked itself. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door, the unease growing heavier with every passing second. The room was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been there, watching, waiting. Frustration bubbled up inside me. I was tired of feeling like I was losing control, tired of second-guessing everything. I yanked the door open and slammed it shut behind me as I left the room, the loud bang echoing through the house. I headed downstairs, determined to calm myself down. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks again. Whatever it was, I needed to get a grip. I made myself some coffee, trying to focus on anything other than the gnawing anxiety that kept creeping back into my mind. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, I couldn't stop thinking about that door, and the shadow, and the noises. Everything seemed to be piling on, one thing after another. That night, I locked my bedroom door again, but this time, I left the spare key on the nightstand. I told myself it was for peace of mind, just in case the door decided to pull another weird stunt. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the door. It was something else, something I couldn't see, but could feel. Something that didn't want me to leave. That night felt different. The air in the house seemed thicker, like the walls were closing in around me. I tried to go about my evening as usual, doing my best to ignore the weirdness that had been haunting me for the past few days. I had my dinner, watched TV, and scrolled through my phone, but the unease was always there, sitting heavy in the back of my mind. I kept glancing at the clock, hoping the night would pass quickly so I could get some sleep and maybe, just maybe, wake up feeling normal again. By the time I went upstairs to bed, the house was dead silent. Too silent. Even the usual sounds, like the hum of the fridge or the distant rumble of cars from the street, seemed to have disappeared. I closed my bedroom door, locked it out of habit now, and climbed into bed. But the second I pulled the covers over myself, I heard it. A loud thunk echoed through the house. It wasn't a creak or a groan, but a deep, hollow sound like something heavy had fallen over downstairs. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to hear any other noise, any footsteps, anything that could explain the sound. But everything went quiet again. I grabbed my phone, checking the time, just past midnight. For a moment, I debated texting Jason again, but I knew what he'd say. He'd tell me I was paranoid, that I was blowing things out of proportion. And maybe he was right. Maybe I was overreacting. But I couldn't ignore that feeling, like something was waiting for me, just out of sight. Then the lights went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness, and my breath caught in my throat. No warning, no flicker, just complete, sudden blackness. The silence was so thick, it felt like I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I fumbled around for my phone, using the screen's dim light to illuminate the room. My hands were shaking as I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. I stood up slowly, scanning the room, half expecting to see someone standing there just watching. But there was nothing. My heart pounded as I moved toward the door, my feet heavy against the wooden floor. I unlocked the door, my hand trembling on the knob, and opened it a crack. The hallway beyond was pitch black. I hesitated, listening for any sound, but the house was eerily still. With the flashlight leading the way, I crept out into the hallway, feeling my pulse in my throat. As I made my way downstairs, the tension in my chest grew tighter. Each step felt heavier than the last, the creaks from the floorboards beneath me sounding too loud in the quiet. My mind kept flashing back to the figure I'd seen, the shadow man standing at the end of the hall just nights before. The thought of him being down here now, waiting for me in the dark, sent a shiver down my spine. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight flickered across the living room. That's when I saw it. He was there again, the shadow man, standing in the corner of the room, just like before. This time, though, there was no window behind him, no light to explain his shape. He was just there, a solid, dark figure, his outline clear against the dim light from my flashlight. I froze, barely able to breathe, the beam shaking in my hand as I pointed it directly at him. But no matter how much light I threw at him, he didn't disappear. I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but my legs were like stone. I stared at the figure, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The shadow man didn't move, didn't flinch. It was like he was waiting for something, just like the first time. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But there was no answer. Of course, there wouldn't be. I don't know why I even asked. The silence stretched out, suffocating, as I stood there, trapped in my own fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the power flickered back on. The light snapped on, filling the room with bright, harsh light. The shadow man was gone. I blinked, staring at the spot where he had been. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my pulse still racing. I scanned the room again, shining the flashlight into every corner, even though the lights were back on. But there was nothing, no sign of him. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm myself down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to believe it had been a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing games in the darkness. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was seriously wrong with this house. I turned toward the front door, and that's when I noticed it. The door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. I'd locked it. I was sure of it. I always locked the front door before going to bed. Panic surged through me as I rushed over, slamming the door shut and locking it again, twisting the knob several times to make sure it was secure. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the key as I shoved it into the deadbolt. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, staring into the living room, my mind racing. How had it opened? And why hadn't I heard it? The house had been so quiet before, no creaks, no sounds. Nothing. For the rest of the night, I didn't go back upstairs. I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Not after everything that had just happened. I sat on the couch, every light in the house on, clutching my phone and the bat like they were the only things keeping me safe. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't help if the shadow man came back. By the time the sun came up, I was barely holding it together. I hadn't slept a minute after the events of the previous night. I spent the whole time sitting on the couch, staring at the front door, half expecting it to swing open again on its own. The image of the shadow man, standing still and silent in the corner of the living room, was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake it, couldn't rationalize it away anymore. I knew I needed help. I couldn't keep pretending this was just my imagination. Something was wrong with the house, something I couldn't explain, So I did what any desperate person would do. I called someone, but not Jason this time. I needed someone who could actually help. I found the number of a locksmith in town, figuring at the very least I could get the door fixed, maybe even have them look at the locks on the windows too. Anything to make the place feel a little more secure. I couldn't spend another night in here without knowing every entry point was locked tight. When the locksmith arrived, he wasn't what I expected. The guy was older, probably in his 60s, with deep lines etched into his face. He wore an old, faded jacket, and there was a calm, almost knowing look in his eyes when he glanced up at the house. It was like he'd seen it all before, like my weird little problem wasn't going to surprise him at all. "You called about the locks?" he asked in a gruff voice as he stood on the front porch, squinting at me in the morning sunlight. "Yeah," I said, running a hand through my hair, feeling the exhaustion weighing down on me. "The front door, it keeps opening on its own. I swear I lock it, but then middle of the night, I find it wide open." He didn't say anything for a moment, just gave me this strange look like he was sizing me up. "Doors don't usually open themselves," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Yeah, I know that." I tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced, even to my own ears. "That's why I need you to check it out." "I don't know. Maybe something's wrong with the lock." The locksmith nodded slowly and stepped inside. As he walked through the house, his eyes roamed the walls, the ceiling, like he was taking everything in, not just the door. It made me uneasy, like he could sense something I couldn't. We reached the front door, and he kneeled down to inspect the lock, running his fingers over the deadbolt, testing the knob. After a few minutes, he stood up, brushing his hands on his pants. "Nothing wrong with the lock," he said simply. "It's solid. You sure you're locking it right?" I frowned. "I'm telling you, I double-check it every night. It's locked when I go to bed, but then it just opens." He didn't respond at first, just gave me another long, thoughtful look. Finally, he spoke. "This house, it's old, right? Been around a long time?" "Yeah, I think so." "Why?" He shrugged, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach twist. Places like this, they have a way of remembering things, keeping things inside. Sometimes the problem's not with the door. I stared at him, not sure I understood. "What do you mean?" The locksmith shook his head, like he wasn't planning on saying more. "Look, I can replace the lock if you want, but it won't make a difference if what you're dealing with isn't physical." That sent a chill down my spine. I didn't like where this conversation was going. "What exactly are you saying?" The locksmith sighed, running a hand over his graying hair. "You're not the first one to live in a house like this and feel like something's off. Sometimes there's something else in the walls, something you can't see but you can feel. You get me?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Are you saying the house is haunted?" He didn't answer directly. I've seen enough strange things in old places like this to know when someone's dealing with more than just a broken lock. I didn't know how to respond to that. The logical part of me wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, that none of this was real. But the other part of me, the part that had seen the shadow man, the part that had heard the footsteps, couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. "So, what am I supposed to do?" I asked quietly. The locksmith looked at me, his eyes serious. "You're going to have to figure that out for yourself. But if I were you, I'd be careful. You might not be dealing with something that wants to be disturbed." His words lingered in the air long after he left. I sat on the couch, staring at the front door, thinking about everything he'd said. What did he mean? Something that doesn't want to be disturbed? Was the shadow man part of the house? Was he trying to protect it? Or was he trying to keep me out? I wanted to believe that it was all just nonsense, that there was a logical explanation for everything that had happened. But after hearing the locksmith's words, after seeing that figure in the corner of my living room, I wasn't so sure anymore. That night, I locked the door again. I checked it 3 times before going to bed, making sure the deadbolt was turned all the way. But as I lay in the dark, my mind kept replaying the locksmith's words over and over. What if he was right? What if I wasn't just dealing with some old, faulty locks? What if I was dealing with something that had always been here? I lay awake for hours, listening to the house, waiting for something to happen. The silence was thick, pressing down on me like a weight. And as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this house, it wasn't done with me yet. That night was the worst yet. The house felt heavier, like something unseen had settled into every corner, every shadow. It was more than just the usual tension in the air. It was like the house itself was watching me, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The feeling that whatever was in here wasn't just passing through. It was a part of this place, something that had been here long before me. I lay in bed, the silence pressing in on me. Every little noise made me jump. A creak in the walls, the soft rustle of the curtains, the hum of the wind outside. I kept my eyes on the door, almost expecting it to swing open, even though I'd locked it. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had started to blur together. My eyes grew heavy, my mind drifting between sleep and wakefulness, but I couldn't relax. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, swallowing up the dim light from my bedside lamp. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I sat up, straining to hear it, convinced I was imagining things. But there it was again, soft and low, like it was coming from the walls themselves. The words were garbled, unintelligible, but they were definitely there. My skin prickled with fear as I listened, frozen in place. It was coming from somewhere near the floor. I threw the covers off and slid out of bed, my hands trembling as I picked up the flashlight from the nightstand. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the wooden floorboards. The whispers grew louder as I crouched down, running the light along the base of the wall. That's when I saw it, a loose floorboard near the corner of the room, half hidden by the edge of the rug. My pulse quickened. I had never noticed it before. It looked like it had been pried up at some point, then pushed back into place. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached out and tugged on the board. It came up easily, revealing a small, dark space beneath. My heart pounded in my chest as I pointed the flashlight into the hole. Something was down there, half buried under a layer of dust and debris. I reached in and pulled out an old, worn journal. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. I sat back on the floor, the whispers suddenly gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. My hands shook as I opened the journal, the faint smell of mold and old paper filling the air. The first few pages were covered in hastily scribbled notes, dates and names I didn't recognize. Whoever had written this was frantic, their handwriting erratic, the words barely legible. But one entry caught my eye, and as I read it, my blood ran cold. Asterisk October 12th, 1998. He's back. I thought I could get away from him, but I was wrong. He never really left. He's part of the house now. Asterisk. I flipped through more pages, my heart racing faster with each new entry. The person who had written this journal, whoever they were, had been living in this house. They described the same things I had seen. The footsteps, the shadows, the door opening on its own. But what really scared me was the way the entries grew more and more frantic, the writer's fear almost palpable through the words. Asterisk, I hear him at night, walking through the halls. He watches me while I sleep. I can feel his eyes on me, even when I close mine. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. Asterisk, the last entry was dated just a few days before Halloween that same year. Asterisk, I tried to leave. I packed my things, but he wouldn't let me go. The door, it wouldn't open. No matter what I did, I couldn't get out. He's part of the house now, and now so am I. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The words echoed in my mind. He's part of the house now. What did that mean? Was the Shadow Man more than just a ghost? Was he something else, something tied to the very foundation of this place? My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I stood up, clutching the journal tightly, unsure what to do next. Should I leave? Should I call someone? The locksmith's words echoed in my mind. Not everything in these old houses is what it seems. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the whispers returned, louder now, clearer. They seemed to be coming from all around me, filling the room with their eerie, disembodied voices. My pulse raced as I backed up toward the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. As I wrenched the door open, something caught my eye. Across the room, standing in the corner, was the Shadow Man. He wasn't just a figure in the dark anymore. He was more solid now, more real, his form clear in the dim light. He stood tall, unmoving, his head slightly tilted as if he was watching me. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized the truth. The Shadow Man hadn't just been watching me. He had been waiting for me. He didn't move as I bolted down the stairs, the journal clutched to my chest. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step, the words swirling in my mind, mixing with the sound of my own heartbeat. I stumbled toward the front door, my fingers fumbling with the lock, but it wouldn't turn. I pulled at the door, yanking with all my strength, but it stayed shut. Just like the journal had said, he wasn't going to let me leave. Panic surged through me as I ran toward the back door. But it was the same. No matter how hard I pulled, no matter how many times I twisted the knob, the door wouldn't budge. It was like the house itself had sealed me in, trapping me within its walls. I turned, my back pressed against the door, my chest heaving with fear. The house was silent again, the whispers gone. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. I wasn't ever going to be alone again.